Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? I'm coming at you guys with another tier list video. This time ranking all the chapters in Dragon's Rising. With the release of Season 3 Part 2, we are finally up to 6 chapters in Dragon's Rising, and in today's video, I'm going to be ranking them and sharing my thoughts on them. Although before I get into things, I just want you guys to keep in mind this list is just going to be my own opinion, yours can be different, and that is totally fine. Feel free to leave your own personal list down below, and let's get into this whole thing. So starting off, we have Season 1 Part 1, and I'm going to put this chapter in C tier. First chapter of Dragon's Rising, in my opinion, overall wasn't that good in my opinion. I don't think it's terrible or anything, but I also don't really think it's that great either, and I feel like there are a lot of problems with it. For starters, I just wasn't a big fan of Eren or Sora during the chapter. For Eren, I honestly thought he was kind of annoying throughout the events of the chapter. It also felt like, despite Eren being marketed as the main character of this chapter and really the season as a whole, it honestly felt like Eren got consistently sidelined throughout the chapter and barely got anything to do. And I also really don't like how things for him basically start off with him knowing how to use Spinjitzu, but the show doesn't really do anything to explain how he was able to learn Spinjitzu on his own without a teacher. So that's something I didn't like. And as for Sora, I just didn't really think she was that interesting as a character overall, and personally, I just wasn't really that invested in her story throughout the events of the chapter or the season as a whole. And as I've brought up a few times in the past, to me, Sora's story in many ways kind of just felt like Mia's story from Season 5 all over again. But that's not all, because there were a few other issues that I had with the chapter. For starters, I think a bunch of the new characters that we got overall weren't that good, and I think a lot of them were either boring or not that well written. Characters like Ryu, Euphrasia, Dr. LaRoe, Durama, and Beatrix, I wasn't really a big fan of any of them. I think the merge, while being an idea that was good on paper, in practice wasn't really handled that well, primarily because I feel like it took away a lot of the mystery and importance of the other realms, and it also got rid of all the older characters right off the bat, and made it really unclear when or if they were going to show up again at some point in the future, so that's something that I didn't like. I was not a fan of how Jay and Cole got basically nothing to do during this chapter, and they only showed up in the first 2 episodes with no speaking lines. That's something I didn't like. And there were a bunch of other issues that I had with the chapter, but there were definitely things about this chapter that I did honestly enjoy. For starters, I liked Kai, Lloyd, and Nia. I feel like all three of them were handled pretty well during the chapter, especially Lloyd with him becoming a mentor and teaching Eren and Sora how to become ninja. That's something that I honestly liked. I really liked Wildfire. I thought that she was an absolutely hilarious character and had a lot of really funny moments. I liked Rapton and Roz. I feel like the two of them were both pretty good antagonists when it came to the chapter. I feel like production value wise, things were honestly pretty good. And even though he didn't get that much to do, I did like that Zane did show up at the end of this chapter. That was something that I liked. But overall, when it comes to this chapter, again, I wasn't really the biggest fan of it. Moving on to Season 1 Part 2, I'm also going to put this chapter in C tier. I think this chapter is slightly better in comparison to Season 1 Part 1, but I still don't really think it's that great either, and there are, once again, a number of issues that I have with it. For starters, I don't like how Zane basically gets sidelined during this chapter, barely getting anything to do, even though after Kai and Nia returned, they did get a lot to do. Again, I wasn't a fan of how Zane barely got anything, and I also really didn't like how Cole, and especially Jay, barely got anything to do during this chapter. That's something that I didn't like. I think a bunch of the characters when it came to this chapter, both when it came to brand new characters as well as some of the returning characters, overall still weren't that great. Characters like Dr. LaRoe and Durama, for returning characters, I wasn't the biggest fan of them. And when it came to some of the newer characters like Aracor and Geo, once again, I didn't really think they were that interesting. When it comes to Beatrix, the main antagonist of the season, I feel like she really only became interesting during the final 3 episodes of the season, and that was about it, so that's something that I didn't like. When it comes to Eren, once again, it feels like he just got sidelined during this chapter, and it feels like he barely got anything to do during it. And when it comes to Sora, her story was alright, although again, I wasn't really that invested in it. And also, when it comes to Sora, I feel like her ending of her unlocking her true potential is a moment that works and is fine, but I feel like that moment could have been better if we had gotten more moments of Sora trying to use her powers without Ryu, instead of Ryu constantly sparking her powers in order for her to use her powers. Again, I feel like that's something that could have been handled a bit better. I'm also not a fan of how this chapter ends with a bunch of things being left really vague and unclear. I get the idea that the show was setting up mysteries for future seasons to explore, but I feel like the show could have done a better job at explaining things in order to make things a bit more clear, because I think leaving things so vague did make it hard to get properly invested in some of these mysteries, and there are still some mysteries that we have in Dragons Rising that were introduced in this chapter and the season as a whole that still haven't been answered yet, which is something that I'm not really a fan of. And yeah, there were definitely a number of issues I had with this chapter, but once again, there were honestly things that I did enjoy about it. Once again, I think that Lloyd, Kai, and Nia were all handled really well during the chapter. Once again, I really like Lloyd being a mentor and him teaching Aaron and Sora how to be ninja. That's something that I liked. I thought that Kai and Wildfire's dynamic was absolutely incredible, and it was one of the highlights of the chapter, I think. Once again, I think that Raptor and Roz were both pretty good villains overall, and I thought the two of them were pretty great. Jordan, I think, also had some pretty solid moments during this chapter, so that's something that I liked. I also feel like the episodes in general during this chapter were slightly better in comparison to stuff that we got in the first chapter. I did think that the first chapter did have good episodes, but I feel like some of the episodes we got this time around were better. And overall, again, I do think that this chapter is slightly better in comparison to the first one, but overall, I still don't think it's that great. Moving on to Season 2, Part 1, I'm going to put this chapter in B tier. This was a chapter that I honestly thought was really solid when it came to Dragons Rising, and I do think it is honestly a good chapter. I definitely enjoyed it, as I feel like there was a lot of stuff going for this chapter. When it comes to the ninja, for the most part, I feel like they were honestly handled pretty well during the chapter. Once again, I thought Lloyd was genuinely really great. We get more stuff with him being a mentor, plus the whole story of him having to work through his anxiety surrounding his visions of the Source Dragons. I thought that was something that was handled pretty well during the chapter. Kai, I thought, was genuinely really great, and I thought we got some really great character work with him this time around. That's something that I thought was really good. Nia, I thought, was also handled pretty well with her helping people work through their emotional issues. I thought that was great. And I like that Cole got more to do during this chapter with him helping Bonzel reunite with Candelaria. That's something that I really liked. Also, speaking of Bonzel, I think this chapter did a good job at expanding on her character and developing Bonzel into a legitimately compelling character. That's something that I liked. I also feel like the chapter was able to do a good job at expanding on Jordana's character as well. That's something else I liked about the chapter. Roz, once again, is an absolutely fantastic antagonist, and I really like seeing him throughout the chapter. He was genuinely really good. I think that Eagle, Toronto, and Candelaria were all pretty solid characters when it came to the chapter. I also really like the fight scenes and fight choreography during this chapter, and really the season as a whole. They are, in my opinion, a pretty big improvement in comparison to the fight choreography in Season 1. And again, there's a lot of things about this chapter that I do like. Although there are definitely some things about this chapter that I wasn't the biggest fan of. For starters, once again, I wasn't the biggest fan of how Zane or Jay were handled when it came to the chapter. That's something that I didn't like. Also, once again, I just wasn't really a big fan of Aaron or Sora when it came to the chapter. When it came to Sora, it felt like she really didn't get that much to do during the chapter. There was her learning how to use Spinjitzu, but that didn't really go anywhere during the chapter, so that's something that I didn't like. And as for Aaron, this chapter essentially acted as the starting point for his corruption arc, and I'm going to talk about that more when it comes to Season 2, Part 2, but overall, I didn't really think it was handled that well. I think that the concept for the Forbidden Five was legitimately really interesting. However, once Noct actually showed up during the chapter, I honestly thought he was pretty underwhelming considering how easily he was defeated by Nia, Lloyd, and Ra, so that's something that I didn't like. And as I've stated multiple times, I do not like Cinder. I think he's honestly a really underdeveloped character when it comes to the show, who's pretty boring and annoying. And also, I really don't like how the show essentially killed off Ash off screen just to introduce Cinder, even though these two characters are pretty similar to one another. But overall, when it comes to this chapter, again, I do honestly like it, and I do think it is a legitimately solid chapter of Dragons Rising. Moving on to Season 2, Part 2, I'm going to put this chapter in D tier. Honestly, I do not like this chapter of Dragons Rising, and being completely honest, This is my least favorite chapter of Dragon's Rising. I am not a fan of it. For starters, the main focus of this chapter being the tournament of the sources feels kind of random if I'm being honest, primarily because there was only one line of dialogue setting this up at the end of the previous chapter, and that was about it. So it being the main focus of this chapter does feel pretty strange if I'm being honest. Also, I feel like the tournament in general when it came to the chapter just wasn't very good overall. For starters, the tournament did feel pretty random at times, primarily because we didn't know what the bracket was, so the matches definitely felt pretty random at times. Also, the rules felt pretty unclear, especially given what was and wasn't allowed, like how Roz was able to use the Malagong Shattering to increase the power of his fighters. That definitely felt like something really weird, so that's something I didn't like. I also feel like a bunch of the new elemental masters that we got during this chapter weren't very good overall, primarily because a lot of them barely had any proper character or personality when it came to the chapter. Plus, I feel like a bunch of the new elemental powers we got either didn't make sense as elemental powers or felt too similar to powers that we've already seen when it comes to the show, so that's something that I didn't like. I think Sora being the one to win the tournament in the end, as I've said before, honestly felt pretty unearned, considering the fact that Sora lost her final match against Noct. Noct was only disqualified because it was revealed that Roz was cheating the entire time, and Sora didn't do that much in the fight against Noct, so her being the one to win in the end, again, I do think that felt kind of unearned. And also, when it comes to the chapter, it in general honestly just felt a bit too similar to Season 4, which is something else I honestly didn't like that much. But that's not all, as there were some other issues that I had with the chapter. Like, for example, I think a bunch of the characters during this chapter overall weren't really handled the best. Whether it was some of the older slash returning characters like Cole and Zane, I didn't think they were handled the best, or when it comes to some of the newer characters, like Roby, who I honestly thought was pretty annoying, or Zeatrix, who honestly just felt a bit too similar to Beatrix in my opinion, so that's something that I wasn't a big fan of. I'm also not a big fan of how Kai had a really big role in the previous chapter, but in this chapter he barely gets anything to do. I feel like that is kind of jarring when it comes to the season, going from Kai getting a lot to do to him barely getting anything, so that's something I wasn't a big fan of. I think that when it comes to Nia, her basically being the only one who was legitimately concerned about Jay and wanted to help him out is something that doesn't make any sense at all, and I don't understand why the rest of the team was telling Nia to wait until after the tournament to go and do something to help out Jay. That, I'd argue, doesn't make any sense at all. And when it comes to Jay, I feel like both he and Eren were by far the biggest issues when it came to this chapter. When it came to Jay, him working alongside Roz and pretty much everything going on with him felt really forced into the chapter, and it didn't feel like it naturally connected into really anything else that we had seen when it came to the chapter. Not to mention, just a bunch of the stuff in general when it came to Jay didn't work, and by far my two biggest problems when it comes to Jay being a villain, not just when it comes to this chapter, but really in Dragon's Rising in general, is that one, it feels way too similar to the Ice Emperor story, and two, it doesn't really have that much to do with Jay's character, because Jay's only a villain because of him losing his memories, Roz manipulating him, and Shadowspin corrupting him. Again, it doesn't really have anything to do with who Jay is, so that's something I didn't like. And as for Eren, my biggest issue with him when it comes to this chapter would be his corruption arc, and how despite the entire premise of the arc being Eren turning to the dark side and him becoming bad, the show very rarely portrays him as actually being in the wrong when he does something bad, even though there are multiple instances during this chapter and in future chapters where Eren does something bad, but again, he isn't really portrayed as being in the wrong for doing that stuff, which in turn, I'd argue, ends up resulting in Eren feeling really unlikable and hard to root for, because the show essentially tries to make it look like he isn't the one in the wrong for doing certain things when he arguably is in the wrong. So that's something I honestly really didn't like. Although when it comes to this chapter, once again, there were definitely things about it that I did honestly enjoy. When it comes to Lloyd and Nia, I feel like they were handled pretty well during the chapter, and I do feel like this chapter did a good job at wrapping up stuff when it came to Lloyd's stories during this chapter, especially his anxiety surrounding his visions. I thought that was handled well. I thought that Wildfire, once again, was absolutely fantastic, and she was definitely hilarious when it came to the chapter. Roz, once again, is absolutely incredible. I thought that he was really good during the chapter, and I also like Noct during this chapter. I feel like this chapter definitely did a good job at turning around my opinion on Noct, and again, there are definitely things about this chapter that I do like, but by and large, I just don't really like this chapter that much, and again, I think it's the worst chapter in Dragon's Rising. Moving on to Season 3, Part 1, I am going to be putting this chapter in A tier. This is honestly my favorite chapter of Dragon's Rising. I really enjoyed this chapter, even though I do think it does have some flaws. Overall, I did think this chapter was pretty good. For starters, once again, I really liked Roz. He was absolutely fantastic during this chapter. I really like seeing a more desperate side of Roz because that results in him being a lot more brutal and aggressive this time around, which is something I thought was really interesting to see. I liked Nia during the chapter, and I liked the idea that her story is revolving around her searching for Jay and trying to get him back to the way he was. I think that makes a lot of sense for her. Once again, I really like Wildfire. I thought she was hilarious and had a lot of pretty great moments during the chapter. I thought that Frack overall was pretty solid during the chapter, and I like the idea of him essentially adjusting to work alongside the Ninja Bear rather than going along with what Roz taught him. I thought that was a pretty solid idea, honestly. I liked Thunderfang during the chapter, even though I don't think he's an incredible villain. I do think the stuff we got with him overall was pretty solid when it came to the chapter, and I especially like his backstory involving his hatred of the Source Dragons. I thought that was interesting. I really like seeing a variety of the older characters that we got when it came to the chapter, especially seeing Pixel and definitely Moro back. The two of them I thought were both handled pretty well during the chapter, especially Moro. His episode in the chapter I thought was absolutely incredible, and it was done really, really well. That's something that I really liked. And even though I do wish Zane got more to do during this chapter, I do think that character-wise, Zane overall was pretty solid when it came to this chapter, and I do think that for the most part, Zane's characterization when it came to the chapter was honestly pretty good. And yeah, there are definitely a lot of things about this chapter that I do enjoy, but once again, there are definitely issues that I have with this chapter. For starters, as I brought up earlier, I do wish that Zane got more to do because this chapter was marketed as being Zane's focus chapter, but it honestly felt like after episode 4, Zane barely got anything to do when it came to the chapter, so that's something that I didn't like. I also wasn't a fan of how, for a majority of the ninja, it feels like they barely got anything to do during the chapter, and it felt like they were mostly just there during it, as it felt like a lot of them didn't really get that much in terms of storylines or character arcs, so that's something I wasn't really the biggest fan of. The Forbidden Five definitely felt really underwhelming when it came to the chapter, as it felt like they barely got any proper character or personality outside of Noct or Rox, and that was pretty much it, so that's something that I didn't like. I don't think the stuff with Jay being a mercenary was handled that well, primarily because the whole thing feels like a really random decision, and it's never properly explained at all why Jay decides to become a mercenary following the tournament of the sources, so that's something I didn't like. And finally, I really did not like Eren during this chapter. I thought he was really unlikable and really hard to root for when it came to the chapter, primarily because when it comes to Eren, Season 2 Part 2 establishes that Eren is aware of the fact that Roz is a liar and a manipulator, and he knows that Roz cannot be trusted, yet Eren still chooses to willingly work alongside Roz all throughout the chapter and basically ignores any red flags associated with working alongside him, all because Roz claims that he can help him find his parents, and Roz throughout the chapter constantly brings up how Wu started the merge, and that's enough to cause Eren to stop ignoring any red flags that he does bring up. And again, this is something that I honestly was not a fan of when it came to the chapter, because again, I think this just results in Eren feeling really hard to root for when it came to the chapter. And yeah, that's something that I didn't like. But again, overall, I did honestly like this chapter. And again, this is my favorite chapter of Dragon's Rising. I think it is honestly pretty good, even though I do think it's also a bit flawed. And finally, we have the latest chapter of Dragon's Rising, Season 3, Part 2, and I'm gonna be putting this chapter in D tier because honestly, I wasn't a big fan of this chapter, and just like with Season 2, Part 2, I have a lot of issues with it. For starters, just like when it comes to Season 3, Part 1, it feels like most of the ninja barely got anything to do when it came to this chapter, and it felt like a majority of them were just there during it, so that's something I wasn't a big fan of. I feel like the conclusion to Eren's corruption arc is something that could have been handled better when it came to the chapter, because the show tries to have this big moment of him choosing to work alongside Roz versus choosing to work alongside the ninja, but again, I don't really think it works that well because, again, Eren was aware of the fact that Roz was a liar and a manipulator, yet he willingly chose to work alongside him, and so I don't really think this big choice works as well as the show wants it to. I also think that when it comes to Thunderfang and the Forbidden Five, they felt incredibly underwhelming when it came to the chapter, with the Forbidden Five barely getting anything to do throughout the chapter. They don't even get lines, so that's something that I didn't like. And when it comes to Thunderfang, once again, he barely got anything. He was essentially just standing around the Spectral Lands waiting for the Forbidden Five to do stuff, and that was about it. That's really all he got when it came to the chapter, so that's something that I didn't like. I also was not a fan of stuff when it came to the Land of Lee. That's a subplot that I honestly wasn't really a big fan of. And Lee as a character is someone who I honestly just don't really like that much. I thought he was kind of annoying when it came to the show. And when it came to Lee, it did feel a bit confusing as to what the writers were actually trying to go for when it came to him. So that's something that I didn't like. But by far my biggest problem with the chapter is definitely Jay. He was so incredibly unlikable when it came to the chapter. And I understand that that's meant to be the point. Jay's supposed to be unlikable throughout the chapter, but it's something that came off as feeling really, really forced because, as I brought up earlier, when it comes to Jay, he's only acting the way he is because he lost his memories, Roz manipulated him, and Shatterspin corrupted him, meaning that when it comes to Jay, he doesn't actually mean any of the stuff that he's saying. He's essentially being forced to act this way. And so when the show tries to have some bigger emotional moments with him, presenting the idea that Jay has gone too far, I don't really think those moments work that well when it comes to the chapter because, again, these moments come off as feeling kind of forced. And yeah, that's something that I really didn't like when it came to the chapter. Now, with that being said, once again, there were definitely things about this chapter that I did honestly enjoy. For starters, I think that both Nia and Cole were honestly handled fairly well when it came to the chapter, even though I do think the big reveal of what Cole found on his journey and what was causing the Earth to scream did come off as feeling kind of underwhelming, because the reveal of the Source Dragon skeleton, I'd argue, just created more questions that the show doesn't really do anything to answer, so that's something that I didn't like. I think that when it came to both Wildfire and Frack, the two of them were handled pretty well, and I honestly did really like Frack during the chapter. I think this chapter is where he's at his best when it comes to the show, even though I do think his crush on Sora did feel a little odd. Still, I thought he was honestly pretty good when it came to the chapter. I think that the production value, especially when it comes to the animation, has only been getting better as time has gone on, with things looking absolutely incredible when it comes to this chapter, especially the fight choreography and the mist that shows up whenever the Forbidden Five and the Spectral Dragonians show up. I thought those look really good. And once again, Roz was absolutely fantastic. Even though he wasn't in this chapter that much, I still thought he was absolutely incredible, and he was hands down my favorite part of the chapter. And so, yeah, when it comes to this chapter, while there are definitely things about it that I enjoy, overall, I don't really think this chapter is all that good, and I do think that it is the second weakest chapter that we've gotten when it comes to Dragons Rising. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. This is my personal tier list when it comes to the various chapters in Dragons Rising, and that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts on this tier list, and also what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to the various chapters of Dragons Rising, and how would you rank them? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.